Hello and welcome. This is a public affairs forum sponsored by the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, Texas. My name is Luther Elmore. We hold these forums to further the mission of the church, to nourish the mind and spirit, and to serve social justice. We've been holding these forums since the church was first incorporated in 1954. They're held on most Sundays, and you can see about the dates and the speakers by going to our church website, www.austinuu.org. To introduce our speaker for the day, as one of our long-time serving members of the forum, Miss Bonnie Gardner. Bonnie?
Thank you, Luther, and welcome everybody. We've got a great program today. We're featuring Chief of Police, Brian Manley, and he's going to be talking about the police department, where we are today, directions for the future. Austin is widely cited as a relatively safe city, despite its rapid growth and size. But the chief will give us an overview of patterns and prevalence of crime and what APD is doing to reduce and prevent crime. He's also going to discuss strategies for community policing and community engagement, as well as evolving policies on use of force under his leadership. Chief Manley has some very impressive credentials, and he's had a lot of experience. He's been with APD since 1990 and currently serves as Chief of Police, of course, so that's 27 years. He supervised many areas of the police department, including patrol, narcotics, child abuse, homicide, highway enforcement, internal affairs, special operations, homeland security, and recruiting and training. So he's kind of done it all. He's led a delegation of APD officers during the 2009 presidential inauguration in D.C., and he commanded a group of special response team officers in a deployment to Houston, Texas after Hurricane Ike. He's also attended the Senior Counterterrorism Officials Seminar in Israel. It's an important training to have. He earned his Bachelor's of Business Administration from UT. He majored in finance, and he then earned a Master's in Science in Organizational Leadership and Ethics from St. Edward's University, and he was recognized as an Outstanding Graduate of the Year in his program in 2004. He then served as an adjunct professor, and that's a labor of love. He he worked in the criminal justice and forensics program there for 5 years, and was awarded a School of Behavioral and Social Sciences Outstanding Adjunct Award in 2012. He's a graduate of the Senior Management Institute for the Police, and he is certified to instruct in leadership in various police organizations. Let's give a warm welcome to Police Chief Manley. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. I'll warn you ahead of time, I'm probably not going to stand back here very much. I'm probably going to move around a little bit, and when I speak, I tend to like to interact with the audience, so there may be a few questions outside of the question and answer period. I do want to start off by telling a little bit just about the Austin Police Department, because what I have found is over the years is not everyone always knows a lot about the department that serves you here in Austin. And I'll start off by asking, we're a city of population almost 1 million now, just within the city, not including the suburbs. We have 1,908 officers here in the Austin Police Department, and then I have another 736 civilian employees. So we're an operation of 2,600 men and women that are here to serve the Austin Police Department, and like other businesses, our core function is public safety. And unfortunately, when something goes wrong in my business, sometimes the stakes and the outcomes are a little bit different than in the businesses that you all work in. And that's why we have to be so focused in what we do and make sure that we are offering the best in training, best in equipment, holding our folks accountable and all of that. In 2016, I don't have my 17 numbers finalized yet. In 2016, we received just over 1 million calls for service through our 911 center here in Austin. We received 1,031,000 calls into our 911 service center, and that resulted in officers responding to 346,000 calls for service. So over the course of a year, officers responded to 346,000 calls, and then in addition to the 346,000, they had another 225,000 self-initiated activities, whether that be traffic stops or suspicious persons or something that they responded to. In that year as well, out of those 1 million calls and the 346,000 that were responded to, we ended up with 47,700 arrests. So in the course of 2016, we arrested almost 48,000 individuals throughout the entire year. I'm going to come back to those numbers a little bit later when we talk about use of force and use of force policies, because I think that they're important. But first off, I want to talk just a little bit about American policing and where I see that we are at in this country right now. As mentioned earlier, I've had the good fortune of being with the Austin Police Department. I'm in my 28th year now, and this is the only department that I've ever served in, and I have had opportunities throughout my career to serve in many different divisions, and I have had the opportunity to travel widely across both this country and then others, but to see policing in America. And I tell you, it's very different today than it was when I started almost 3 decades ago. There's a lot that has changed, and there's a lot of reasons for that change. But as I stand here today, I tell you that I think American policing right now is at a crossroads. We're at a place where we haven't been since the civil rights era in our country, where people are questioning what we do, why we do it, why do we do it the way we do it. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. First thing I think really that has driven this change, and it's not that policing has changed so much, but it's the invention of technology, because technology really changes the world in so many different ways. And the ways that technology changes my business, my profession, is that everyone in the community now, for the vast majority of people, is walking around with what? A video camera. And so we're getting a lot of publicity on things that happen across the country, and that's a good thing, because it highlights what's going on in American policing. But it also has the effect of giving the impression that things that are happening in states connected or very far away from us are localized. And so I'm going to come back to that as well. The other thing, along with technology, that has become challenging with the fact that cameras are everywhere and video cameras are everywhere is social media. Because, 3 decades ago, you had an incident occur in your community. It would be on the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, the 9 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news, and then tomorrow's a new day, and there's a new story. In social media, what we have is we have an event that occurs, and it gets posted, it gets tweeted, it gets retweeted, it gets liked, and it gets Snapchats, and it gets sent, and it's over and over and over. And so we've got this tremendous influx of information, and it creates the sense, in my opinion, that policing is broken, because what traditionally gets put out there, it's not when officers get things right? It's when we had something that went really wrong, maybe. And it gives that impression that if that's all you're seeing, that's what's happening. And so I always talk about how we have to own the mistakes of our profession. We are not a perfect profession, and we're not going to be a perfect profession. I'm proud of the Austin Police Department. We are very progressive, and we do really, really, I think, hard work towards being the most professional police department that we can be. But we're going to make mistakes. And as a profession, we have to own those mistakes. But we also have to recognize that for every one of those videos that we see that goes public that may represent the worst of policing, on that same day in communities across this country, you had a couple 100,000 men and women putting their life on the line for total strangers, doing the job for the right reason, because they are a public servant. They have the heart of a servant, and they want to give back to the community. So I say we have to own where we don't get it right, but we have to make sure we recognize where we do get it right. American policing is a little bit different than other models as well. There are 18,000 police departments in America. 18,000 different police departments across our country. When you look at some of the other countries like the European model of policing and all of that, you have a state-led police department, right? You have one police agency that oversees the entire country, one set of rules, one set of expectations, one leadership structure. We don't have that here. We have 18,000 different departments. And so these incidents that occur, and the majority of these departments will have 10 or fewer officers. Very, very localized. And again, that's just because, our country is pretty much built on local control. And so that's what we have here. We have 900,000 men and women serving as police officers across America right now. 900,000 men and women that wear a uniform similar to mine, that go to work every day to serve their communities, sometimes at great risk to themselves. We do a lot before you can become a police officer as far as vetting you to make sure we're hiring folks that should be police officers, because really it all backs up to recruiting. We have to make sure we're recruiting the right men and women into this profession, and then we're giving them the absolute best training possible, giving them the best equipment possible, because we're going to be putting them out in the community in some pretty uncertain environments. If you could think about trying to write a policy or a procedure for every single call a police officer gets called to, you can't do it. We always say no two situations are alike, but even those situations that are alike aren't exact, and there's always going to be different nuances to all of that. And so what we always preach to our officers is common sense and good judgment. At the end of the day, we're going to train you to the best of the abilities. We're going to give you the industry standards, the leading edge cutting practices. We're going to give you the best technology. But at the end of the day, we're hiring men and women because they have exemplified what we believe is the ability to think through complex situations and come to the appropriate decisions, with the use of force, again, being the last thing that we ever want our officers to be involved in, recognizing that sometimes it'll be inevitable. Saying all of that, before we will hire someone, we go through extensive background checks. The application for the police department, it's online now, but back when it was in written form, it was a 30-page written application. And you were going to put down everywhere you ever lived, everyone you ever knew, everywhere you ever worked, and we contacted them because we have to make sure that we're only bringing people into this profession that belong in this profession. And I often say that if you look at the numbers across the country, and if we're willing to give ourselves credit to say we are so good at vetting our candidates, we are so good at doing backgrounds on the men and women who want to be police officers, and how thorough we are and how we do it, that we get it right 99% of the time, because we're that good. If we're willing to say we're that good and we get it right 99% of the time, what does that mean? It's the 1%, right? That means there's 9,000 men and women across this country with a badge and a uniform and a lot of authority that don't deserve it. So that's why, people ask me what keeps me awake at night. You always worry about the safety of your men and women in this line of work. I always do. And there's nothing I can ever do to get around that. What worries me is that we have every system in place and all of that to identify if we have one of those officers as early as possible, so that we can take the corrective action that's necessary. So that's the backdrop with which we're policing right now in this country. It is a challenging time, and people will ask, are you having a hard time recruiting? Are you able to get men and women to still want to join your police department, given what we're seeing going on across the country, and given that, in some communities, officers are being sent to prison for actions that they've taken on duty? Are you having a hard time recruiting? And I would tell you here in Austin, no, we don't. For a couple of reasons. Number one, if you have the heart to serve, if you have the passion to serve, if this is what you want to do, there's no pulling you back from the brink. You're going to follow your heart, and you're going to want to join on. I also tell folks, it's just, this is the time to join policing, because we are redefining policing for the next generation. Somewhat out of necessity, because of all the questions we're getting asked, and questions on legitimacy and on tactics and on why we do things, and then some just to address the advances in technology and the changes in society. So as much as this is a difficult time to be in my profession, it really is also an exciting and an innovative time because we really are setting it up for the future. So that's the backdrop. Let's talk a little bit about Austin. Austin is the 11th largest city in the country. We are now up to number 11. We will breach the top 10 here within the next, I want to say they're 5 to 7 years. We will move up another notch. But right now we are the 11th largest city in the entire country. When we compare ourselves and the crime rates in Austin to our partner cities, and we compare ourselves to like cities with a population over 500,000, we're the 5th safest major city when it comes to violent crime. Austin is a safe city. Used to be number 2. We slipped to number 4 a couple years ago, and then this year we're number 5. Part of that is due to 2 new cities being added to the list because when they added on with their populations finally exceeded 500,000, and when they got on the list, they were safer than us already. But part of that is we've seen a little bit of an uptick in crime over the past couple of years, as have many major cities across the country. Being the 5th safest major city, again, that's a great accomplishment, but we don't sit back and say that we're comfortable with that. We continue to work towards trying to implement policies and practices and using the resources that we have in the best way possible to have the greatest impact on overall safety for this community. Property crime's a little bit different. We have a little bit of a greater challenge with property crime here in Austin. A lot of that is because we've got in my opinion, we've got a large student population here, and students, those of us that have teenagers currently or have had them in the past, we know that at sometimes they're not always the most responsible and don't always lock the doors and not leave things on the front seats of vehicles and all of that. So oftentimes we make ourselves easy victims by not following the simple rules of take, lock, hide, don't leave things in open spaces. We also have a lot of apartment complexes and living situations like that where large parking lots, if they're not well lit, if they're not having any type of security or anything, make themselves pretty ripe for victimization as well. So what we do when we look at policing here in Austin, because again, I have 1,908 sworn men and women to serve this community. We've had a couple of studies done on the Austin Police Department over the past 5 years looking at staffing and appropriate staffing for a city our size, and what those studies show is that we are vastly understaffed, that we need a lot more officers than we currently have. The first report was done by the Police Executive Research Forum back in 2012, I believe it was, and it said at that time we needed an additional 257 officers. We just recently had a study that was done by the Matrix Corporation that again said that we need in the 200 officer range as well. So what we have to do is make sure that we can't sit back and complain that we don't have enough officers to do our job. We have to do our job with what we have. And so that's where we get into the strategies. And as introduced, I was going to talk a little bit about what we're doing. We're making sure we're using the resources where they're going to have the greatest effect. Your police department is a data-driven police department. We invest a lot of money in technology. Like many of you in your businesses, you may have a business intelligence tool. The police department has a business intelligence tool. We use MicroStrategies, and we collect as much data as we can. We collect data on every police report, every citation, every stop, everything, and we dump it all into our database so that we can then do analysis on the data and identify where and when is crime occurring, how is it occurring, and then really trying to get to the why so that we can do preventative policing instead of responsive policing. So I bring that up because the community has a role in that. There is a responsibility in this community to allow us to do what we do to the best of our abilities. And oftentimes what we'll hear is we're out in the community, going to the forums, having the meetings, having the discussions, and people will report that they have been the victim of a crime. Someone broke into their car and stole CDs or something, but they didn't report it because they knew it would take the police a couple hours to get there, and we're not going to catch the person anyway. So what does that do? In the grand scheme of things, it identifies that we've obviously got concerns in the community, but we were just deprived of that data point when I come at this from a data analysis perspective of knowing that we had a crime occur in that community at that time under these circumstances. So that doesn't get fed into any of the discussions or any of the calculus that we do when we decide where we're going to deploy our officers to. So the more times that occurs, the more times people take it upon themselves not to report when something has happened, then unfortunately, we're not going to recognize a trend or a pattern or a hot spot in this city that we might have otherwise and deployed resources to. So yes, if you call, we might take the report over the phone instead of sending an officer. It might take us a couple hours to get there because it's not the highest priority call at that time. But we do need the information because we will use it when we do the analysis, again, to decide how to best police our city, how to best place our resources to make sure that we are getting to the root cause and hopefully finding those prolific offenders that are the ones that are responsible for the majority of crime. If we could get the top 5% of our offenders in this city off the streets, we would clear up over 80% of the crime. Think about that. If we can get the top 5%, because they're prolific, they're repeat, they do this constantly. And that's where the community can help us to make that report. We also live in a day and age where, homeland security threats. And let's face it, Austin is an area of interest. We have a lot of things here in Austin that are of interest to people. We have a lot of critical infrastructure and key resources here. And those are things that, on top of just policing as it was 3 and 4 and 5 decades ago, not only just worrying about keeping your community safe from those within our community that would do us harm by theft and burglary and assault, but from those outside our community who would do it from the terrorist perspective. And again, we're the 11th largest city in the country. We've got major educational institutions. We've got major corporate headquarters here. We've got a lot of public utilities here. All of these things make themselves target opportunities for those that would wish to do so. So I say that for the See Something, Say Something campaign, and this goes back into the reporting and all of that. We can only be in so many places at so many times and see what we're going to see. But as a community, you all know better than us 99% of the time what looks right in your neighborhood and what looks wrong, what looks out of place, what looks off. And if you see something like that, if it just doesn't look right or if it looks suspicious, if something is wrong, just call us. If it's urgent, call 911. If it's not urgent, it just doesn't look right, call 311 and let us know. We can go out there and we can take a look and we can identify whether there is something going on that we should be concerned about, whether this was some type of a surveillance, whether this was some type of an operation, or we can clear it and we can move on. So again, we live in that day and age where we have to take ownership for our own safety. We hosted ACL last year, the weekend after the Las Vegas massacre, the very next weekend. So as a profession and as a country even, we're still trying to unravel what had just happened in this country that we've never seen anything like before, and at the same time realizing we're about to have the next largest outdoor music festival with attendance up to 80,000 people a day, and how do we make sure that doesn't happen here? And you've got 5 days to figure it out. That's the world we live in. And if you saw the messages that we put out on the back end of that, I had a couple of key points, and one of them was take responsibility for yourself. We no longer live in a world where the police department can protect you from every threat. And so it's the simple things. In an event like that, stay sober, first of all, so that you don't have to worry about us coming in to rescue you. You can be part of saving yourself or helping somebody else. Know where your exits are. We're in a house of worship right now, right? And have we seen houses of worship targeted in our country, unfortunately, more times than we would like to? Absolutely. Know where your exits are. Know what you would do if something happened in this very moment. And that's the world we live in now. Not to be hypervigilant and not to be, make everyone on edge all the time. You just have to be aware. And we need to be a partner in that. And that's why we do things like trainings for churches on security, on measures you can put in place to make sure that your sanctuary is safe, and to make sure you have a plan and you know what you would do if you had to face that here. So policing is so different today. It's beyond what it used to be as far as just responding to the call and then going to the next call. We really do try and protect the society, protect the structures, educate people so that you all can partner with us in our efforts to keep Austin safe. Again, because there's only so much that we can do. Now, as we move into the new year, one of the things that we're doing too is we really are revamping how we are doing community policing in Austin. This is my number one. This is my number one focus of the year outside of just crime fighting, and that is completing what we started last year, and that is redoing our whole community policing structure and our approach. A lot of this came from the consulting report that the Matrix Company did on us last year. They talked about how to engage the community and how to build relationships. And when we looked at what we were doing, Austin Police Department has been practicing community policing since I joined the department. And the reason I know that is because when I joined in 1990, we had a community policing division and it had 2 officers. That doesn't work, because community policing isn't, all right, those 2 officers are our community police officers, the rest of us are real cops. That's how it started, though. It did. We're well beyond that here in Austin, in that every single police officer is a community police officer. I don't need an office of community policing. I have one. It's called my department, because that's what we do. That is our core. That is how we do things. But as with all things, you can always improve and do better. And we looked at some of the things that we were doing. Community forums, commander forums. Just by show of hands, any of you all attend commander forums? Okay, got one in the back. Got a couple hands going up. That's what I'm going to talk about. So, just quick show of hands as well. How many people don't know what a commander forum is? That's the problem, right? So, commander forums are something that we've been doing for years. And that is where the patrol commander that is over your region of Austin, your sector, comes out there and hosts a meeting that to bring the community in and to have a conversation like we're having today. Hey, here's what's going on in the neighborhood. Here's what the crime patterns are. Here's what we're seeing. And then to open it up for questions and comments and dialogue with the community. And you know what we get? We get the same people every month or every 3 months, depending upon which part of town we're in and the frequency of them. We get the same people, which is great that those people are involved and we enjoy their engagement and we enjoy working with them. But we recognized we're not reaching Austin. Not all of Austin. We're not reaching parts of the population that don't have the ability to travel to get to the meetings, or that due to economic and family circumstances have to work multiple jobs and can't take an evening off to be with us. So we've changed our approach. We'll still do those forums, but now what we're doing is we're finding established meetings out in the neighborhood in smaller parts of the community, instead of trying to do it for the entire command, drilling down into specific neighborhood meetings. And we're interjecting ourselves into those meetings. Can we come to your meeting? And can we talk about what you want to talk about? Instead of asking the community to come to us and talk to us about an agenda that we have set and then having questions, we're trying to force ourselves out into the pre-existing meetings. We're surveying across the city right now, trying to get feedback on what's important to you in your neighborhood, because being the safe city that we are, it's got a lot of positives in that the likelihood of you being touched by violent crime in our community, very, very minimal. Now, we focus a lot of efforts on that because the impact of violent crime is so significant to those that experience it and their loved ones, but sometimes what we miss are the things that are impacting you at a greater level. Things that we might consider nuisance crimes. We don't ever call them lesser crimes, because if they're impacting the quality of life, then that's a problem. So we're really trying to reconnect with the community, get engaged at more of the neighborhood subdivision, neighborhood association level, and get this kind of feedback so that we can understand that when we're not focused and not having to spend time on the violent crimes, and we've got some time for engagement, that we know where and what we should be doing based on the wants of the community. So we're doing a lot of engagement this year. What you'll find is the national studies will say at a minimum, a police department should have 35% of their time available for community engagement. 35% of a police officer's time should be available for them to do community engagement. I'll talk about that. First though, Austin, when we started 3 years ago and we started tracking these numbers, we were at 17%. We've been able to add some officers and retool a little bit. We're at 24% now. We're well short of what the national experts say is the minimum. And I don't like to be minimal in anything, but we're well short of just being minimal in that area. So that's where we talked about staffing a little bit and some of the challenges and the work that we'll be doing with our elected officials to try and get to a level that is appropriate for this city. But the community engagement time is critical because that's where we build the relationships. We don't want the officers to be seen as someone who drives into your neighborhood, does something to your neighborhood, and then leaves your neighborhood. We want the police officer to be somebody that you know and that spends time in your neighborhood, stops at the neighborhood park if there's kids out there playing for a few minutes, jumps out of the car, hits a baseball, throws a football, does something for a few minutes, just talks to a child, and then gets back in the car and goes and takes another call. Stops at the neighborhood business to go in and talk to the business owner to say, what's going on in the neighborhood? What are you seeing? You having any problems? You having any challenges? What can we do better? That stops in your neighborhood meetings, your neighborhood watch programs, so that when you unfortunately have a need for an officer and you make that call and the officer that shows up to your house, there's a much greater likelihood you will know that officer than not. Now let's face it, we're the 11th largest city in the country. We've got 1 million people here, and that's not always going to be the case. But where we're at right now is so far and away from where we should be and trying to build those relationships. And that's what we're really going to push. Again, getting into these meetings, getting to know the community, not only bringing the community to us, but going out to the community and engaging at every level possible so we can ensure that we're providing the level of service, number one, that this community deserves, and number two, that the community wants. We're good at tracking what we need to track. We can track violent crime all day long. I mean, we know what the murder rate is. We know what the robbery rate is. I know that last year my aggravated assaults went up significantly, and that's going to be a focus area for me this year. I know that my traffic fatalities are still a challenge in this community. Those are the things that we could pay attention to, and even the causative factors. You know, Austin's got, unfortunately, a drinking culture. We've got an entire entertainment district in the downtown part of Austin that feeds that, and we've got a group of society that jumps right in, and that leads to what we have with the traffic fatality challenges here, the DWI fatalities, the fact that last year it was 5,640 DWI arrests in 2016. 5,640 DWI arrests. And you know, for every one that we arrested, we missed a lot because we just don't see them all. We don't have enough officers out there. That's a problem. So we're good at tracking all that and following up on that. We're really trying to go the extra mile now to understand what other issues are of concern to this community. So that's kind of a focus this year as we roll into the full implementation of the Matrix report. Working also towards a way where we can survey this community after every police interaction. If you get stopped by a police officer, once that interaction is over, get on an app and tell us, how did that interaction go? If an officer comes to your house because you were burglarized or something happened afterwards, get online. Send us a report. Let us know how we're doing. Now we've got to make it something that's open and accessible to those that may not have all of the technology that some folks have, because if that's the only way we're going to get true feedback from the entire community. But when we live in this technological era that we do, why aren't we doing that? So again, we're going to focus on that so that we can make sure, again, that we're meeting expectations. There are things we are always going to do because we have to do them. There are things that we will do that the community will not like, but it's part of the law enforcement agency's responsibilities. But we have to make sure we're doing everything we can do to meet the expectations of the community as well. I'll talk a little bit about use of force, which we call response to resistance in the Austin Police Department, and de-escalation, because that's pretty important. We call it response to resistance intentionally. Some people think that we do it because it sounds softer. It doesn't sound as harsh, and we don't like to use the word force. That's really not the reason. The reason we call it response to resistance is because I can think of no greater way to emphasize to the men and women of the Austin Police Department that you should only be using force if you're encountering resistance by calling it response to resistance. Because that's the only time you should be using force, is if you're encountering some type of resistance. Now, that resistance may be passive resistance, it may be aggressive resistance, but we train our officers to understand all the different levels of resistance and then what the appropriate response is. We follow something called the dynamic response to resistance model, and you could look it up. It's a training model that's available that agencies use. But the expectation is that officers will use only the amount of force necessary to overcome the resistance that they're encountering in that moment. That's the expectation. What the courts will require is that the officer's use of force be reasonable. What does reasonable mean? The Supreme Courts have established this through Graham v. Connor, and they talk about the reasonableness is what a similarly situated officer would have done in the exact same circumstance. So if I have an officer that is 5'4" and 100 pounds, what's reasonable for that officer to do in a certain circumstance may be different than a 6'6", 300-pound officer who has different abilities and all of that. It comes down to reasonableness. So what we train them to do is to follow the dynamic response to resistance model, to identify the levels of force that they are encountering, the levels of resistance, and to respond accordingly. I think there's a lot of advancements that have been made in technology that allow us to track this better, and specifically the camera systems. We've had in-car cameras here in Austin for many years, and we've been fortunate that that has allowed us to record incidents as they're occurring, but not everything always is going to occur in the view of that camera, right? Officer gets out of the car, and they're going to go into the house. They're going to go somewhere, and now we have audio, but we no longer have video. I'm pleased to tell you that should be by the end of the summer, we should have every single Austin police officer equipped with a body-worn camera. We are well into the distribution right now. We had 2 tragic incidents at the end of 2017. If you will remember, we had 2 separate circumstances where subjects were attacking others with knives, and our officers responded. And in both of those circumstances, both officers were threatened with the weapon by the suspect, and both officers ended up involved in shootings. Both of those are captured on body-worn camera. I've seen the video, and I can absolutely tell what has happened. So I think it's important that that gives us the opportunity to get another view of these incidents to make sure that we are, number one, following our training, following our tactics, following our policies, but 2, to identify, can we be doing something better? Can we be doing something different? If we had an officer in that circumstance where the subject was coming at him with the weapon, the first thing is, if you have the opportunity and you can, create distance. The two biggest assets an officer has in these encounters, if they can do it, is time and distance. Get yourself more time, get yourself more distance, because what's happening during the time you're getting more time and more distance? You're getting more resources. More officers are showing up, which leads to a better opportunity that you will not end up in as high of a use of force response to resistance incident. So technology, again, is helping us in this area. Let me give you some numbers just to put it in perspective. And I want to make sure I get them exactly for you here. We had 47,000 arrests, again, as I mentioned, 47,078 when those numbers were run for 2016. How many of those arrests do you think involved a use of force by our officers, a response to resistance? And how many of those, as a percentage, how many What percent of time do we use force when we make an arrest? 5? Wow, y'all are good. 4%. For Austin, it was 4%, 4.4, I believe, of the time we're using force. So what that says is 95% of the time we're taking away someone's freedoms and liberties and all. We're doing it with absolutely no use of force. We have 3 levels of force in Austin. We have 4 now. We just created a 4th, which is the lowest level. But for the numbers I'm going to give you now, we broke out the 3 into 2 levels. But for the numbers I'll give you now, the use of force is number 1 is the most serious, and that is anything that's capable of causing a fatal, serious bodily injury or death. And then a level 2 is an intermediate level, and that would be like a baton strike to a targeted area on the legs or on the arms. Then the number 3 would be the lower level. 2 would be a taser deployment also with prongs, and then a number 3 would be a taser as a stun gun or pepper spray or something. So 3 is the lowest level. When we look at our use of force, we used force 4.4% of the time. So when you take the 47,000 down to just those circumstances where we used force and look at those, 89% of those were level 3, the lowest level. You satisfied? Should you be? You're missing one key factor, aren't you? I could skew these numbers all day if I want by one simple thing. And what is that? How do I define force? Force in the Austin Police Department is anything beyond unresisted handcuffing. Anything. Wrist twist, arm behind the back, anything where we have to overcome force. We have, if not the most, one of the most all-inclusive definitions of force. So when we look at these numbers, we should be a little more comfortable knowing that we have a definition that is pretty inclusive. But there's one other challenge, and what is that? Thank you. It's all on self-reporting, right? So I don't sit back and say I'm comfortable with it. We build in systems of auditing so that we make sure that the expectations we've put in place, every response to resistance, use of force incident gets reviewed by the chain of command. Depending upon how serious it was is how high up in the chain of command it goes. But we build in a system of auditing. Because we have seen in this community before, have we not, where some things have gotten through that should have gone to a higher level of review and might have had a different outcome. So we make sure that we do everything we can do to have a system that is all-inclusive of what should be reported and that has checks and balances to identify where we've come up short or where maybe a supervisor hasn't recognized something that they should have recognized. So again, we are not a perfect agency, but I think that we get a lot of things right here in Austin when it comes to the response to resistance. So I think I've kind of hit on the key points, and I feel like time is kind of getting to where I'm going to open it up for questions now so that you all have some time. But I want to thank you in advance of giving me an opportunity to come out and talk to you about what I think are really important things here in Austin, things that we're doing right, things we're doing to engage the community, to build the Austin that every Austinite deserves across the city. And again, I think I also highlighted the importance the community plays in that to make sure that we are getting it right and that we're getting it the way that the community wants it. So with that, I'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Chief Manley. We only have about 15 minutes left, and so we'll have a short period for questions and answers. If you would please identify yourself and keep your question short and to the point so that the Chief can answer as many questions as possible.
Thank you, Chief, for being with us today. Dale Beulah, I've communicated with Art Acevedo quite a bit about vehicle purchases. When they made the last vehicle purchase, several of us really pushed hard to emulate cities like Chicago and New York, where virtually every one of their patrol cars was either a hybrid or a plug-in, to not only save money, but also keep the air cleaner. The vehicles that were chosen to be purchased, the big monster-looking SUVs, of course, they had all this problem with carbon monoxide related to that. My question is, are you thinking about our clean air when vehicles are purchased, as well as our climate protection plan that the city has adopted for future purchases.
Sure. So, yes, vehicles obviously critically important to the police department. Now, I cannot think of another police department that has ever had to ground your entire fleet of police cars. Try keeping your city safe when you just had to put 400 police cars and mothball them. It was quite a challenge, but the men and women of Austin did their best, and I'm proud to say that we're coming out of that now. As far as the vehicles, we do work in those areas that are non-frontline patrol to bring in alternative fuel vehicles, and whether that be the flex fuels or electric vehicles. So we've got some in the police department that are in a non-frontline capacity. I think as we see these vehicles become more prominent in use in other police departments, and we can truly gauge the effectiveness, like I said, you said it, major police departments are using them now. I think we may see opportunity here in the future. Not right now. With the plan that the vehicles that we're going to be purchasing this year for the frontline police vehicles, we're not looking at anything that's electric yet. But for support vehicles, that is something that still gets discussed every year when we meet with the fleet manager to look for those opportunities. And again, it's just given the environment in which the officers work. You mentioned the size of the vehicles. We use the Explorer platform. Which is, in my sense, just my estimation, that's an intermediate. It's not a large, because the larges are, say, the Tahoes and the Suburbans and all, and we will be getting some of those in as well based on assignment. What often goes unnoticed is the equipment and the technology that has to go in a police car today. If you were to lift the trunk of a police car and look in there, there are computer servers, there are modems, there is the back end for what you see in the front end. The laptop computer has an entire back end in the trunk, and then all of our radios, because our radio system nowadays, post 9/11, I don't want to just talk to Austin. I want to talk to every community around. So the size of the vehicle sometimes is dependent upon all of the equipment that we have to put in them.
Hello. Thank you for being here. And
Sure.
particularly, I liked hearing about your comments about the community policing. And I may define community policing a little differently in that I like the citizens being involved. And I'm not sure, by the way, I'm Peggy Morton.
All right.
And I'm a member of this church, First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. And I'm also quite an activist with the immigrant community in Austin. And we have created the Austin Sanctuary Network, which I believe you've heard about. We're a coalition of 27 congregations and nonprofits. And basically, we're stepping up where our politicians have not. There are a lot of holes, as you know, in immigration law. It hasn't been addressed in a while. What we're doing, one of the big things that we're doing, is we work to stop deportations. Right now, we have a friend from El Salvador, an undocumented friend who is living in this congregation, taking sanctuary, staying away from things for 24/7. Right now, we're trusting that ICE isn't going to go in churches because they have a tradition of this. But things are starting to get more heated, as I'm sure you know. To give you okay, I'll get to a question. First, I do want to make sure you know about Sulma Franco, a Guatemalan woman who first took sanctuary in this church back in 2015. And she ended up right now, instead of being deported to Guatemala, which she had that deportation order, would probably be murdered, but instead she has a U.S. resident card. Another church has 2 people living. We have one. I would like to know your thoughts about the Austin Sanctuary Network and what the work that we're stepping into.
I think I'm going to back it up to comments that I actually made at the state legislature when SB 4 was a big issue here in Austin, okay? We talked about Homeland Security, and we talked about terrorism and all that a little bit earlier. We absolutely have to have strong borders in our country to protect people from coming in that would do us harm. But that's far and apart different from what the local police department's responsibility should be, in my opinion, when it comes to immigration enforcement. We are set up as a government with agencies that are entrusted with that responsibility, and they can go about that in the way they need to. My position is that as your police department, when I sit here and talk about how we don't even have enough time to do community policing the way we want to do it and engage the community and do the things we need to do, the last thing that we need to be spending time on is civil immigration law enforcement. It does not make the community safer by enforcing civil immigration. People will say, well, are you a sanctuary city? No, we're not a sanctuary city. And the reason I say that is because if you're a criminal in Austin, we're coming after you with everything that we have, regardless of your immigration status, but not because of your immigration status. So it's involving and going after crime that is going to do harm to others versus a status crime, an immigration crime. So I think that we've been pretty vocal as law enforcement leaders across Texas on what our opinion was of SB4 when it went through, and Austin being one of the cities to jump on the lawsuit, again, to try and limit the impacts of that. We will comply with law because we have to, but I do not think that it is the responsibility of the local police department, the Austin Police Department, to be involved in civil immigration law. Thank you. Specifically, I think that y'all are doing good work for folks. So I'm not going to speak for what the federal government is going to say about that. But again, we're not focused on someone who is here without legal status unless they're committing crime. And if they're committing crime, then my opinion would be different.
Thank you so much for your service to us, Chief. Really appreciate it, and clearly your leadership. You are a passionate community servant, and we really appreciate that. I've lived here over 50 years. My name is Richard Halpin, and I've seen a constant situation where violence is done to people of color, from Bobby Hernandez to this young woman who was violently treated by an officer for seemingly no reason, and another black woman who has been followed allegedly by the police and arrested several times for insignificant issues. What's going on here? Why are these things happening? Why is this pattern happening to people of color in our community? And what are you going to do about it?
You know, I think first of all, what we should talk about, and I'm going to get to the point, we open ourselves up to criticism. We had the Center for Policing Equity a couple of years ago wanted to come in and study Austin's data on disparities, on arrests and enforcement, use of force, all of that. Oftentimes we'll get think tanks, whether it be universities or people working on their thesis or other social agencies that want to come in and want to do research and want to do studies. And a standard practice when you're doing these, and for those of you all that may have done these in your work, is you give anonymity. You know, we won't identify you. So when Center for Policing Equity came to us and told us this plan that they had and what they wanted to do, they wanted to come in and get all of our use of force data and broken down by demographics and all. And they outlined what the report would look like, and they said, but it will be anonymous. We will name you as a major city police department in the Midwest. And why I'm proud of the Austin Police Department is we told them no. Do your study, but name us as the Austin Police Department. Because whatever's happening here is happening here, and if it's good, then let's be that model. And if it's not, then let's understand it and look for opportunities to improve. So they did their entire study, wrote their report, and what did it show? We have disparities. We weren't surprised. But it dug deeper into multiple different layers about what is leading to the disparities. And that's the conversation. I am responsible for a part of it within my organization, but when we look at where our police calls for service occurring more frequently, obviously you would expect, I would think, that it's going to be in some somewhat lower socioeconomic neighborhoods where crime is more prevalent in the streets than the crime that takes place in more affluent neighborhoods behind closed doors. And so we spend more time in those communities. We have more interactions in those communities. And so let me just cut to the chase. What do I expect and what am I going to do? I'm going to hold the officers accountable if they get it right, and we're going to commend them when they, I'm going to hold them accountable if they get it wrong, and we're going to commend them when they get it right. And so that's it. You have absolute standards, and then you enforce the standard. Because a response to resistance, it's right or it's wrong based on what happened in the circumstance, not based on the specific characteristics of the person involved. Now, what I'm not paying attention to the larger picture of if you have patterns, then you've got to get into the pattern and find out why. Are we choosing to be in these neighborhoods unnecessarily, or are we being called into these neighborhoods? And I will stand here and tell you that I believe that a young boy of color has just as much right to walk to his neighborhood store in safety as an Anglo child in a more affluent part of Austin. And sometimes that's going to require a greater police presence due to the circumstances of the neighborhood that one young boy lives in versus another and the crime that's occurring in the streets. So we do expect to have more encounters, but every encounter needs to be professional, needs to be appropriate, and the outcome needs to be based on the circumstances of the encounter, not the specific demographics of the person that we're interacting with.
Hi, I'm Joanne. My simple question is, in the Austin community, do we have patrolling, and how does patrolling in the community work?
Yes, so we have a patrol bureau in the Austin Police Department, and I think these are the men and women that you see most frequently. These are the men and women that are driving the police cars, and they're responding to the calls for service. Gave you the numbers earlier. We get a lot of calls for service here. So the patrol officer's day looks like coming in for a briefing before shift, going out, logging into their computer, and then the life of a police officer, you go where your dispatcher or your computer tells you you're going. You're going to go to the call for service, the next call for service. And so are you, and I think maybe what you're asking, I don't know, is just more random patrol. And so random patrol occurs when the officer has free time, when they're not running from call to call to call. That's the 35% of time I want for community engagement. We have about 24% right now. We've got a little bit of a ways to go because of some staffing issues and all. But when the study was done on the police department, they actually ran numbers that they broke down the day of the week by the hour of the day, the number of officers that were on based on our scheduling matrix, and the number of calls that occurred during that time on 1 year's worth of data. And there were multiple times in any given week where the call load exceeded the number of officers that we had. So I bring that back to you just to say that, yes, there is time, and when officers have that time where they're not running from call to call, that's when we expect them to do things like enforcing traffic safety to keep the neighborhoods safe, and then maybe doing what we call directed patrols. If you or a neighbor called in that you're having a problem in your neighborhood and would like more of a police presence, then that's when we'll go in and we'll do directed patrols as well.
Chief Manley, we're out of time, unfortunately. I know there are some others who have additional questions. We appreciate your time and your work and trying to keep us safe, and we will try to provide you with assistance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you. Thank y'all.